They called it the Killer, a beautiful monster with bent wings and a heart of fire that murdered its own pilots before it ever met the enemy. The Vought F4U Corsair, faster than anything in the sky, deadlier than a rattlesnake in a cockpit, and so terrifying that the U.S. Navy refused to let it land on their carriers. But the men who learned to tame this beast would turn it into the most feared weapon in the Pacific, a screaming angel of death that made grown enemy pilots weep. This is the story of how America's most dangerous fighter became its greatest. The year was 1938, and the world was hurtling toward war. In the corridors of the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington, naval officers gathered around tables covered with blueprints and performance specifications, their faces grave with the knowledge of what was coming. Europe was already fragmenting under the shadow of fascism. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific were growing bolder by the month, and America's carrier fighter force was hopelessly outmatched by what intelligence reports suggested the enemy was developing. The Navy's current frontline fighter, the stubby Grumman F4F Wildcat, was a solid machine, reliable, tough, honest. But it was also slow, its rate of climb anemic, its range limited. The men in Washington knew that when war came, and it would come, American pilots would need something better. Something revolutionary. Something that could dominate the sky not through numbers but through sheer, overwhelming superiority. The specification they drafted that year was audacious to the point of fantasy. They wanted a single-seat, carrier-based fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, a speed that seemed almost incomprehensible in an era when most fighters struggled to reach 350. They wanted it to climb like a rocket, to carry heavy armament, to possess the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel to fight its way home. They wanted, in short, a miracle wrapped in aluminum and rivets. Several aircraft manufacturers submitted proposals, each one pushing the boundaries of what was aeronautically possible. But it was Vought Aircraft, a relatively small company based in Connecticut, that proposed something truly radical. Their chief designer, Rex Beisel, understood that meeting the Navy's impossible demands would require equally impossible solutions. Conventional thinking wouldn't cut it. This fighter would need the most powerful engine available, the largest propeller that could physically be attached to a single-engine aircraft, and a design philosophy that threw caution to the wind in pursuit of raw performance. Beisel's team selected the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a Titanic 18-cylinder radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower, more power than two locomotives. To harness that brutal force, they needed a propeller of equally massive proportions, 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter, a spinning disc of metal larger than many small aircraft were tall. And here's where the problem emerged, stark and unavoidable. For a carrier-based fighter, ground clearance was everything. The propeller couldn't strike the deck during takeoff or landing, and carrier decks weren't exactly spacious, level runways. They pitched and rolled with the sea, they rose and fell with the waves. A conventional straight-wing design would require landing gear so absurdly long that the aircraft would be top-heavy, unstable, a death trap waiting to tip over on the deck. The weight of such gear would eat into performance, negating the very advantages they were trying to achieve. Rex Beisel stared at the problem for weeks, turning it over in his mind like a Rubik's Cube with no solution. Then, in a moment of inspiration that would define his career, he saw it. The wing didn't have to be straight. What if it bent? What if the wing root angled downward from the fuselage, then bent back upward at the point where it met the landing gear? This inverted gull-wing configuration would place the landing gear at the lowest point of the wing's arc, dramatically shortening the gear legs while still providing ample clearance for that enormous propeller. It was elegant. It was weird. It looked like nothing else in the sky. Engineers on the team thought he'd lost his mind. The aerodynamics would be a nightmare to calculate, the structural stresses at the bend point would be enormous, and the Navy might reject the design simply because it looked so strange. But Beisel pushed forward, and when the mock-up was finally presented to naval evaluators in 1939, they were stunned. It was ugly and beautiful simultaneously, aggressive and awkward, a predator that didn't quite look like it should be able to fly. But the performance projections were undeniable. The Navy awarded Vought a contract for a prototype, designated XF4U-1. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. climbed into the cockpit of the prototype at Stratford, Connecticut, and fired up that massive R-2800 engine. The sound was apocalyptic, a thundering, crackling roar that rattled windows and set off car alarms blocks away. When Bullard released the brakes and opened the throttle, the Corsair leapt forward with violent acceleration, its tail lifting almost immediately, that huge propeller clawing at the air like it wanted to tear the sky itself to pieces. The aircraft lifted off and climbed with an aggression that left ground observers speechless. In the weeks that followed, test flights revealed performance that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. On October 1, 1940, during a high-speed run, the XF-4U became the first U.S. single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, reaching 404 miles per hour. It was a watershed moment, proof that American aviation engineering could compete with anything the world had to offer. The Navy was thrilled. Orders were placed. Production ramped up. The Corsair was going to war. But then the pilots started dying. Not in combat, the Corsair hadn't even reached operational squadrons yet, but in training, in routine flights, in approaches that should have been textbook perfect. The aircraft that had seemed so promising, so revolutionary, was revealing itself to be a killer. The problems were numerous and terrifying. First, there was the cockpit position. To accommodate that massive engine and maintain the aircraft's center of gravity, the cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage, nearly at the wing's trailing edge. This gave the pilot an abysmal view forward and downward, critical perspectives during carrier landings, where judging altitude and attitude relative to the deck was a matter of life and death. Pilots described it as trying to land while looking through a mailbox slot. The long nose stretched out ahead like the hood of a Cadillac, completely obscuring the landing area during the critical final approach. Carrier landings were already one of the most demanding tasks in aviation. Threading a moving needle in turbulent air, catching a wire with a tailhook while the deck rose and fell beneath you, and the Corsair made it exponentially harder. But poor visibility was the least of the aircraft's sins. The real killer was the stall characteristics. In most aircraft, a stall, when the wing loses lift due to excessive angle of attack, announces itself with clear warning signs. Buffeting, sluggish controls, a gradual loss of responsiveness that gives the pilot time to react. The Corsair's stall was different. It was sudden, violent, and asymmetric. Without warning, one wing would drop sharply, rolling the aircraft inverted in a snap motion that left pilots no time to react. At low altitude, during the slow-speed approach to a carrier deck, this wing drop was instantly fatal. The aircraft would roll, the nose would drop, and before the pilot could process what was happening, the Corsair would cartwheel into the ocean or smash into the carrier's stern. It earned a grim nickname among naval aviators, the Ensign Eliminator. Young pilots, fresh from training and eager to prove themselves, were being killed at an alarming rate. Squadron commanders started to dread the arrival of new Corsair deliveries, knowing that each aircraft represented another potential funeral. Engineers at Vought and the Navy worked frantically to understand what was happening. Wind tunnel tests and flight data eventually revealed the culprit: airflow separation over the wing root during high angles of attack. The wing's design, particularly near that distinctive gull-wing bend, created complex aerodynamic effects that caused one wing to stall before the other, resulting in the deadly asymmetric roll. The solution, when it was finally discovered, was remarkably simple. A small strip of metal, about 6 inches long, attached to the leading edge of the wing near the root. This stall strip deliberately disrupted the airflow at that critical point, forcing the wing root to stall at the same time as the rest of the wing, giving the pilot buffet warning and preventing the sudden roll. It worked, but the fix took time to implement across the fleet, and even with the modification, the Corsair remained a challenging aircraft to fly. The Navy's patience was running thin. By 1942, with the war in full fury and carrier battles determining the fate of the Pacific, naval commanders made a fateful decision. The F4U Corsair was too dangerous for carrier operations. It would be relegated to land-based duty, stripped of its intended role, a thoroughbred fighter forced to operate from muddy island runways instead of the rolling decks it had been designed for. For many aircraft, this would have been a death sentence, a humiliating demotion that would see it fade into obscurity. But the Corsair found salvation in an unexpected place: the United States Marine Corps. Marine fighter squadrons, operating from rough forward airstrips on Pacific islands, didn't have the luxury of being picky about their equipment. They needed fighters that could protect their brothers on the ground, that could escort bombers, that could dominate enemy fighters and come home to dirt runways carved out of jungle and coral. When the first Corsairs arrived at Marine bases in late 1942 and early 1943, the pilots approached them with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They'd heard the stories, the speed, the power, the deadly reputation. But Marines have never been known to back down from a challenge. Squadron leaders like Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a hard-drinking, harder-fighting former flying tiger with a chip on his shoulder and a genius for aerial combat, saw in the Corsair not a problematic aircraft but an opportunity. It was fast, faster than anything the Japanese had. It was tough, that massive radial engine could absorb punishment that would down other fighters. It was heavily armed, 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, capable of tearing enemy aircraft to ribbons. The Marines learned to fly the Corsair not by fighting its characteristics but by understanding them, by respecting the beast and working within its limitations. They learned to maintain higher speeds on approach, to be smooth with the controls, to anticipate the stall and never let the aircraft get slow and sloppy. They learned that if you treated the Corsair with respect, if you didn't get cocky or careless, it would reward you with performance that made you feel invincible. And once Marine pilots mastered the aircraft, they took it to war with a vengeance that shocked the Japanese and thrilled American commanders desperate for good news from the Pacific. The first Marine Corsair squadrons to see combat were VMF 124 and VMF 213, deployed to the Solomon Islands in early 1943. The fighting there was brutal, daily dogfights over steaming jungles and turquoise waters, against Japanese pilots who were skilled, determined, and flying the exceptional Mitsubishi S6M0, an aircraft that had terrorized Allied forces for 2 years. The Zero was light, maneuverable, could turn inside almost any Allied fighter, and had been flown by some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. But the Corsair changed the equation. Marine pilots quickly learned that they couldn't dogfight with Zeros in a turning battle. The Zero would win every time. Instead, they used the Corsair's strengths, speed and power. They would dive from altitude, slash through enemy formations with their 6 guns blazing, then use their superior speed to climb back to altitude before the Zeros could react. It was brutal, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Pilots described the sensation of diving in a Corsair as both exhilarating and terrifying. The aircraft would accelerate so rapidly that the wind noise became a scream, the controls stiffened, and the whole machine vibrated like it was on the edge of tearing itself apart. But it held together, and when you squeezed the trigger and felt those 6.50 caliber guns hammer away, when you saw your tracers converge on an enemy fighter and watched pieces start flying off, there was no feeling like it in the world. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would eventually become a Marine Corps ace with 21 kills, described his first combat kill in a Corsair with almost religious intensity. "I came down on him out of the sun, and he never saw me. When I fired, it was like the hand of God reached down and swatted him from the sky." The Corsair didn't just shoot, it obliterated. As Marine squadrons racked up kills, the Japanese began to fear the Corsair with a superstitious dread. Part of this was due to the aircraft's combat effectiveness, but part of it was due to something entirely unexpected: the sound. The Corsair's wing design, with its distinctive inverted gull shape and large air intakes at the wing roots for oil cooler and supercharger, created a unique aerodynamic effect. When the aircraft dove at high speed, air rushing through those intakes produced an eerie, haunting whistle, a rising wail that could be heard from miles away, a sound that announced death was coming. Japanese soldiers on the ground and pilots in the air came to recognize that whistle with terror. They called the Corsair Whistling Death, and the name spread through the Japanese military like wildfire. Radio intercepts captured Japanese pilots warning each other, "Corsair diving," followed by frantic evasive maneuvers. On the ground, Japanese troops would dive for cover at the first hint of that whistle, knowing that napalm, bombs, or rockets would soon follow. The psychological impact of that sound cannot be overstated. War is as much about breaking the enemy's will as it is about destroying their equipment, and the Corsair's whistle became a weapon in its own right. American commanders, once they realized the effect, encouraged Corsair pilots to make high-speed passes over Japanese positions even when they weren't actively attacking, just to demoralize the troops below. It worked. Captured Japanese soldiers and documents repeatedly referenced the terror of the whistling death, describing how the sound would drive men to panic, to abandon positions, to freeze in fear rather than fight back effectively. By mid-1943, Corsair squadrons were utterly dominating the aerial battlefield. The aircraft's kill ratio climbed to staggering heights. By war's end, F4U Corsairs would achieve an overall kill ratio of 11-1, meaning for every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat, 11 enemy aircraft were destroyed. This was unprecedented, a level of air superiority that allowed American forces to operate with near impunity across vast stretches of the Pacific. The Marines weren't the only ones learning to love the Corsair. The British Fleet Air Arm, with its typical stiff upper lip practicality, had accepted Corsairs through Lend-Lease and deployed them to carriers despite the Navy's reservations. British pilots developed a curved approach technique that improved visibility and reduced the likelihood of stall-related accidents. They proved that the Corsair could operate from carriers after all. It just required better training and modified procedures. The U.S. Navy, watching the British success and the Marines' stunning combat record, began to reconsider their earlier rejection. Pappy Boyington and his famous VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron became legends flying Corsairs. Boyington, a maverick who had been kicked out of one Marine squadron for insubordination and drinking, assembled a collection of misfits, troublemakers, and outcasts, pilots who had been rejected or reassigned from other units, and turned them into one of the most effective fighter squadrons in the Pacific. Flying from primitive airstrips on islands with names like Vella La Vella and Bougainville, the Black Sheep tore through Japanese formations like wolves through sheep, their Corsairs painted with distinctive kill markings and nose art. Boyington himself shot down 28 enemy aircraft before being shot down over Rabaul in January 1944, spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, and his squadron's exploits would be immortalized in books and television. But Boyington always credited the Corsair for much of his success. "Give me a plane that can take punishment and deal it out in equal measure, and I'll win every time." The Corsair could do both. As the war progressed and American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, the Corsair evolved beyond its role as a pure fighter. The aircraft's robust construction and powerful engine made it an ideal platform for ground attack missions, a role that became increasingly important as the fighting moved closer to the Japanese home islands. Engineers began outfitting Corsairs with bomb racks and rocket rails, turning them into fighter bombers capable of delivering devastating strikes against ground targets. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marine Corsairs provided relentless close air support for the infantry fighting across that volcanic hellscape, dropping bombs and napalm on Japanese bunkers that had pinned down advancing Marines. Pilots would fly mission after mission, sometimes 6 or 7 sorties in a single day, landing only to refuel and rearm before heading back into the maelstrom. The ground Marines, watching those bent-wing fighters dive through flak to deliver bombs within meters of their own positions, developed a fierce love for the Corsair and the men who flew it. At Okinawa, the Corsair faced its greatest challenge and its finest hour. The battle for that island, from April to June 1945, was the bloodiest and most brutal of the Pacific War. Japanese forces, fighting with suicidal desperation, unleashed wave after wave of kamikaze attacks against the American fleet offshore. The skies became a nightmare of exploding aircraft, anti-aircraft fire, and fighters locked in desperate combat. Corsair pilots flew combat air patrols from dawn to dusk, intercepting kamikaze strikes before they could reach the ships. It was exhausting, terrifying work. There was no glory in shooting down a damaged bomber being flown by a pilot who wanted to die, but it had to be done or American sailors would burn. Marine Corsairs also provided close air support for the Grinding Ground campaign, attacking Japanese positions with bombs, rockets, napalm, and machine gun fire. The aircraft proved it could do it all: dogfight, bomb, strafe, escort, patrol. It was versatile in a way few fighters have ever been. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the F4U Corsair had firmly established itself as one of the greatest fighter aircraft of World War II. But unlike many wartime aircraft that quickly faded into obsolescence with the arrival of peace, the Corsair had a long life ahead of it. Production continued until 1952, with over 12,500 aircraft built, more than any other piston-engine fighter in U.S. history, except the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Corsair served in the Korean War, where it once again proved its worth as a ground attack platform, flying missions against North Korean and Chinese forces in a conflict that looked very different from World War II but still demanded rugged, reliable aircraft that could take punishment and deliver firepower. Some Corsairs remained in service with foreign air forces into the 1960s, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. The men who flew the Corsair in combat never forgot it. Veterans would speak of the aircraft with a mixture of affection, respect, and a hint of fear. The way you might speak of a loyal but unpredictable dog that saved your life but also bit you once. They remembered the sound of that R-2800 engine roaring to life, the vibration through the stick, the acceleration on takeoff that pressed you back into your seat. They remembered the way it dove, the way it climbed, the way it could shrug off damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. They remembered the whistle, that eerie wail that struck terror into the enemy's heart. And they remembered their friends who died learning to fly it, young men who never got the chance to master the beast, who paid the ultimate price for piloting a machine that demanded perfection and punished mistakes with swift, brutal finality. The Corsair's legacy extends far beyond its combat record. It represented a philosophy of aircraft design that prioritized performance above all else, that was willing to accept difficult handling characteristics and a steep learning curve in exchange for unmatched speed and power. It proved that, with proper training and respect for the machine, pilots could master even the most challenging aircraft and use them to devastating effect. It demonstrated that innovation sometimes requires radical solutions, that bent wing wasn't just clever engineering, it was a statement that conventional thinking wouldn't win wars. The Corsair also highlighted the importance of persistence in the face of failure. A lesser organization might have given up on the aircraft after those early deadly accidents, might have scrapped the program and started over. But Vought, the Navy, and the Marines stuck with it, identified the problems, fixed them, and turned a killer into a war winner. Today, a handful of F4U Corsairs still fly at air shows, maintained by passionate collectors and aviation enthusiasts who want to preserve this piece of history. When one of these aircraft makes a high-speed pass, when that distinctive whistle cuts through the air and that massive radial engine thunders overhead, spectators feel a visceral connection to the past. They're hearing the same sounds that Japanese soldiers heard before napalm rained down, the same sounds that Marine pilots heard when they pushed the throttle forward for one more mission, the same sounds that defined air combat in the Pacific during the most consequential war in human history. The Corsair is a reminder that great machines are often difficult, that excellence requires sacrifice, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in the world are also the most dangerous. The bent-wing bird with the heart of a lion and the temperament of a wolverine, that was the Corsair. It killed the men who didn't respect it and made legends of the men who did. It terrified an empire and helped bring an end to the most destructive conflict humanity has ever known. And its legacy lives on, not just in museums and air shows, but in the memory of everyone who understands that sometimes, to achieve the impossible, you have to be willing to fly a machine that should probably kill you but instead makes you invincible. The Whistling Death earned its name in blood and thunder, and its story will echo through aviation history forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the incredible story of the F4U Corsair, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. There's so much more aviation history to explore together. Drop a like if this story grabbed you, and I'm genuinely curious. If you could fly any World War II fighter aircraft, would it be the Corsair despite its dangerous reputation? Or would you choose something else? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.